A2.1 Origins of Cells. Note that this entire video is HL only content. Our two essential questions are, what plausible hypothesis could account for the origin of life? And what intermediate stages could there have been between non-living matter and the first living cells? So let's begin by looking at pre-biotic Earth. Remember that biology is the study of life. Bio means life, so pre-biotic means before life. Now, early Earth conditions were pretty rough. We can look at ancient rocks and we can determine that the prebiotic atmosphere contained very low levels of free oxygen and therefore ozone, high concentrations of methane due to volcanic activity and meteorite bombardment, as well as high concentrations of carbon dioxide due to volcanic activity. Currently, we enjoy an ozone layer around our planet. It protects us by absorbing ultraviolet radiation from the sun. This would not have existed on the early Earth due to lack of oxygen. Remember, the reason that we wear sunscreen is to protect from those high energy ultraviolet rays. Taking a look here at the visible light spectrum, remember that as we head towards the blue-violet end of the spectrum, the wavelengths are getting shorter and therefore higher energy. So ultraviolet rays are even past the violet end of the visible light spectrum. They're even shorter wavelength, higher energy, and that is why we wear sunscreen to protect ourselves against skin cancer from these ultraviolet rays. And so if the ozone layer is protecting us from a lot of the ultraviolet rays, how much damage could be done to our DNA from having larger amounts of high energy shortwave ultraviolet radiation entering our planet if there was no ozone layer present? All of these conditions together resulted in higher temperatures and higher UV ultraviolet light penetration. One thing that ultraviolet light might have done that would help lead to life is that chemical reactions may have occurred spontaneously under those ultraviolet high energy radiation that may not occur spontaneously today. Now, this might have allowed a variety of carbon compounds to form, including nucleotides and amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. Once living organisms had evolved, they caused enormous changes to conditions on Earth, including they increased the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere from approximately 0 to 20%, which is where we are at today. About 20% of the air around you is oxygen. We greatly reduced the level of carbon dioxide, formation of the ozone layer, allowing protection from UV light, and reduction of the greenhouse effect. The term biotic refers to living things, and abiotic refers to non-living things. Now, all living things are made up of cells. Living organisms can be as small as a single cell, or they may have many cells, which we then call multicellular. Individual cells use energy to maintain a highly ordered state. Cells can divide to produce more cells, but note that individual components of the cell are not self-sustaining. So this mitochondria is not self-sustaining. It's not alive on its own. This Golgi apparatus is an organelle within a cell, but it is not considered to be alive on its own. The smallest unit of life is the single cell. Now, viruses are not considered to be alive because they are not made out of cells. They can't keep themselves in a stable state. They don't grow, and they can't make their own energy. Viruses are very simple. They're basically just genetic material inside of a protein coat. And so they are going to require a host in order to be able to replicate. And so we don't consider them to be alive because they cannot do that without a host. Now, cells are highly complex structures. They can currently only be produced by the division of pre-existing cells. And here we see a cell where we've had replication of all the DNA in the nucleus, and this cell is about to divide and pinch off into two new daughter cells, each of which is identical to the parent cell that it started as. Now, if all cells have to come from pre-existing cells, that begs the question, well, where did the first cell come from? In order for the first cell to show up, there are 4 challenges that would have had to be overcome. First up, we would have needed to have self-assembly. We would have had to have simple molecules become more complex molecules. Next, compartmentalization would have had to occur. A membrane must develop to enclose the cell contents. The cell itself has to be different from the environment. Catalysis must occur. Catalysis is the acceleration of a chemical reaction by a catalyst, and we're going to talk about how enzymes are proteins that act as catalysts that speed up chemical reactions, and without them, those reactions would not occur fast enough to support life. And lastly, we would need to overcome the challenge of how can we self-replicate. A cell has to be able to replicate in order for inheritance to occur. Quick nature of science moment. Note that claims in science, including hypotheses and theories, must be testable. In some cases, scientists have to struggle with hypotheses that are difficult to test. In this case, the exact conditions on prebiotic Earth cannot be replicated. The first protocells did not fossilize, and so it's very difficult to test some of the theories of where the first cells came from. The Earth is not like it was back then, so we can't set it up exactly as it was. And we can't look back in the fossil record because early cells or pre-cells were not strong enough to fossilize. We know the only things that fossilize are hard materials like bones and teeth. And so early cells that are made up of a membrane and some genetic material are definitely not going to have left a mark in the fossil record directly. We did do our best in the Miller-Urey experiment in the early 1950s to replicate those conditions. And so we could try as best we can to take our hypotheses in early Earth conditions, including we believe that there was methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen gas. And these simple elements were added to this enclosed flask, and there were electrodes that gave a spark discharge to simulate lightning. And this was run for a week. It was allowed to cycle through a condenser, through a boiler, in order to simulate what early Earth conditions might have been. And amazingly, after running for a week, when they looked at what was in the flask, there was more than 20 amino acids that had spontaneously formed from these simpler molecules under these conditions, which demonstrates that if these conditions did in fact simulate prebiotic Earth accurately enough, it was possible for that first challenge to be overcome, for carbon compounds to form spontaneously before life evolved. Now, the second challenge, remember, was how can we separate a cell from its environment? And so it turns out that phospholipids, which make up cell membranes, have the molecular properties of having a hydrophilic, water-loving head. So this head is going to be attracted to water. It also then has two hydrophobic tails, water-fearing. And so we're going to see that when phospholipids are in an aqueous solution, a water-based solution, they spontaneously form a bilayer where the heads face both outwards into this water-based environment as well as inwards into the center where now we have created a space that can become the first cell. And those nonpolar tails facing each other are going to help form this structural layer that doesn't require any energy to form. It's just based on the molecular properties of this molecule. And in fact, experiments have shown that these bilayers spontaneously form spherical structures called vesicles. We can explain how the third and fourth challenge can be overcome by looking at the fact that RNA could have been the first genetic material. Now we know today we use DNA, and we use enzymes as catalysts to drive the metabolic reactions to keep us alive. The problem is, in order for DNA to replicate, we need enzymes. But in order to make enzymes, DNA would be needed. And so we have this problem of how did this all start? Now it turns out that RNA can both be replicated and has some catalytic activity. And so if RNA was the initial genetic material, that helps overcome both challenges 3 and 4. It may have acted initially as both the genetic material and the enzymes of the earliest cells. Therefore, it's likely that RNA was the first genetic material. Additional evidence that supports this theory is that even today, RNA in the form of ribozymes, seen here in the ribosome, are still used to catalyze peptide bond formation during protein synthesis. LUCA stands for the last universal common ancestor. The most likely explanation for that universality of the genetic code, that we all use DNA as our genetic information, is that all organisms inherited that DNA from some common ancestor that had DNA. And so everything alive today, as well as the things that have gone extinct since Luca, are represented by these branches here. And so all of these living things, and those that are not anymore, would have shared the same genetic information that Luca would have, our last universal common ancestor. There are also cell structures such as ribosomes and certain enzymes that are essentially the same in all living organisms. It is likely that other forms of life may have evolved, and that's indicated by all of these other branches. However, they would have become extinct due to competition with Luca. And so this would have outcompeted these other branches and they would have gone extinct, leading to what we see today is all of the descendants of this last universal common ancestor. Let's look at some approaches used to estimate dates of the first living cells and Luca. Now we know from studying geology that the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Big G is the metric prefix for billion. The earliest uncontested evidence of life comes from the Strelley Pool formations in Western Australia. They contain large structures that resemble fossilized stromatolites. These date from 3.42 billion years ago. Now, a stromatolite is formed when mats of cyanobacteria, so living bacteria, single-celled prokaryotes, in shallow seawater, trap sediments and secrete calcium carbonate, slowly building rocky mounds over thousands of years. So these rocky mounds aren't the actual fossilized bacteria. Bacteria would not have been left in the fossil record, but the evidence of that bacteria is what we're seeing here. The evidence of them being alive 3.42 billion years ago. Another approach is using isotope ratios to try to determine the date of the first living cells. Carbon originated from living organisms has a low carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio, and rocks have been discovered with a depleted carbon-13 ratio dating from as far back as 4.1 billion years ago. So remember, if Earth was 4.5 billion years old, it's possible that living organisms evolved 4.1 billion years ago. A final approach used to estimate the dates of life beginning is using genetic information. When genes replicate, they sometimes make mistakes, and we call those mistakes mutations. And mutations occur at a fairly known rate, and so we can actually count back and look at the number of mutations and the differences between two species to estimate when those species diverged. And if we just keep counting back and back, we estimate that the first living cell would have been nearly 4.5 billion years ago, pretty close to the origin of our planet. In summary, life has been evolving on Earth for an immense length of time, and I like this visual because it just really shows that Homo sapiens are really new to the game. We just show up right here in this last sliver. Now, all of these challenges we've talked about today that need to be overcome may have been overcome at these hydrothermal vents. These are undersea cracks in the Earth's surface. They're characterized by this gushing hot mineral and chemical-rich fluids. These chemicals represent readily accessible sources of energy, which early cells would have needed to assemble carbon compounds into polymers. In fact, fossils have been discovered from ancient seafloor hydrothermal vent precipitates that provide evidence of the vents being the location of the origin of life on Earth. Scientists have identified hundreds of genes that occur widely among the group of organisms that originated early in the history of life, including bacteria and archaea. A wide distribution of those genes suggests that the genes were inherited from Luca. If that original common ancestor had the genes, they would have been passed on to all of the descendants of that organism. These genes are needed for anaerobic metabolism and for fixing carbon dioxide and nitrogen. And so from this, we can deduce that Luca lived in an environment with high concentrations of hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and iron, and these are the exact conditions present in and around hydrothermal vents in the ocean, which provides additional evidence that this is likely the location of the first living organisms. All right, hope that was helpful, and good luck out there.